Samuel's boots hit the church steps with a hollow thud that echoed through the empty morning air. The guitar case on his back felt heavier than usual, weighted down by 3 days of walking and the memory of a dying man's last words. Millbrook's white church loomed before him, its pristine walls a stark contrast to the weathered buildings that lined the dusty Texas street. Word had traveled 20 miles through colored churches about a singing job. Good pay for a man with a voice like his. Mrs. Henderson needed someone to lead music for her late husband's memorial service. What she hadn't mentioned was the color of Samuel's skin, and what Samuel hadn't expected was the locked gate and the pastor's thin smile. Pastor Williams emerged from the church shadows like a scarecrow come to life, all sharp angles and disapproving lines. His pale eyes swept over Samuel with the kind of practiced dismissal that came from years of keeping order in a world where everyone knew their place. "You lost, boy?" Pastor Williams asked, blocking the church entrance with his black-suited frame. Samuel removed his hat, holding it steady despite the tremor in his hands. "No, sir, Pastor. I'm Samuel Washington. Mrs. Henderson sent word about leading music for her husband's service." "Mrs. Henderson?" The pastor's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. "There's been some mistake. We don't allow coloreds in this church." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, but he'd heard them before in different towns from different men who wore their hatred like Sunday suits. He'd also heard something else. Desperation in Mrs. Henderson's message, carried by a field hand who'd ridden 20 miles just to find him. "With respect, Pastor." Samuel kept his voice level. "The lady seemed particular about wanting me to come. Said her husband heard me sing at the colored church in Beaumont and it was his dying wish." Pastor Williams stepped closer, tobacco and aftershave mingling in the still air. "I don't care what Eleanor Henderson thinks she wants. This is a house of God and we have standards." From inside the church came thin, reedy voices attempting a hymn, lacking the power these walls could hold. Samuel closed his eyes, remembering his father's calloused hand on his shoulder, lessons about dignity and knowing when to stand firm. "Pastor, I came a long way. Maybe you could ask the lady herself?" Before the pastor could respond, a woman's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Pastor Williams? Is that the musician I sent for?" Eleanor Henderson appeared in the doorway, and Samuel understood immediately why her late husband had been a man of influence. She carried herself with quiet authority, silver hair pinned back severely, black dress, simple but expensive. Her pale blue eyes, sharp as winter, took in the scene with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent 70 years learning how to read people and situations. "Mrs. Henderson," Pastor Williams began, his voice taking on a conciliatory tone. "There's been a misunderstanding. This person claims you sent for him." Eleanor's gaze fixed on Samuel, and he saw something flicker in her expression. Recognition, or something deeper. "Are you Samuel Washington?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you knew my husband?" Samuel's throat tightened. "I sang at his favorite spot down by the creek. He used to come listen when he thought nobody was watching. Sometimes he'd leave money in the old oak tree." The widow's face went very still. Pastor Williams looked between them, confusion and irritation warring in his features. "Henry never mentioned," the pastor began. "Henry mentioned a great many things you wouldn't understand," Eleanor said, her voice carrying steel tempered by years of loss. "Pastor Williams, I've buried my husband, and I intend to honor his memory properly. If he wanted this man to sing, then this man will sing." The pastor's face flushed red. "Eleanor, you can't possibly—" "I can, and I will." She stepped aside, gesturing for Samuel to enter. "This is still my church, Pastor. My family built it, and my money keeps it running." Samuel felt the weight of history in that moment, the careful balance of power and prejudice that governed this small town. He could see the conflict in the pastor's eyes, the war between conviction and practical need. "If you insist," Pastor Williams said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "But I want it on record that I oppose this irregularity." Eleanor Henderson's smile was sharp as a blade. "Duly noted." As Samuel crossed the threshold, he felt the congregation's eyes upon him. The singing had stopped and silence thick enough to cut filled the space. He could see shock on their faces, hands moving to cover children's eyes, whispered words that carried more venom than any snake. But he also saw something else, curiosity in some faces, and in others, something that might have been hope. The church fell silent as Samuel walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing against wooden floors. The congregation sat frozen, faces mixing outrage and bewilderment. Children peered around their mothers' skirts, having never seen a colored man inside these sacred walls. Eleanor Henderson walked beside him, chin raised defiantly, black dress rustling with each step. She led him to the front pew, traditionally reserved for the pastor's family, and gestured for him to sit. "Mrs. Henderson," Pastor Williams called from the pulpit, voice strained. "Surely you don't intend for him to sit with the congregation." Eleanor turned slowly, pale eyes fixing on the pastor with a look that had probably cowed better men. "Pastor Williams, today we honor my husband's memory. Henry Washington Henderson was a man of God, and he believed that all of God's children deserved to be heard." A murmur rippled through the congregation at the mention of Henry's full name. Samuel felt his breath catch. Washington, the same name he carried. "Mrs. Henderson," he whispered, "did you say Washington?" Eleanor's eyes softened for the first time since he'd met her. "My husband's middle name, given to him by his father in honor of a man who worked our family's land, a man who sang spirituals while he worked, who taught the children, including my husband, that music was the voice of the soul." The pieces began falling into place. Samuel's grandfather had worked these lands, had sung in these fields. The stories passed down through generations suddenly made sense. The white boy who would sneak away to listen to the songs, who would leave coins and sometimes food. "Your grandfather was Samuel Washington," Eleanor continued, her voice carrying across the silent church. "My husband never forgot those songs, or the man who sang them. When he was dying, he made me promise to find you, to let you sing the songs that shaped his soul." Pastor Williams stepped down from the pulpit, his face pale with shock. "Eleanor, you can't mean to tell us that Henry that he associated with, that he learned about God's love from a man whose skin was darker than his own?" Eleanor's voice cut through the air like a whip. "That he believed salvation came through the heart, not the color of one's flesh?" "Yes, Pastor Williams, that's exactly what I'm telling you." An elderly woman in the third row stood up, her hands shaking as she gripped the pew in front of her. "This is blasphemy. We won't stand for it." "Then leave," Eleanor said simply. "The door is behind you." Samuel watched as several families began to gather their things, their faces twisted with disgust and anger. But others remained, uncertain, caught between years of conditioning and the authority of the woman who had just challenged everything they thought they knew. A young woman near the back, barely out of her teens, stayed seated despite her husband's urgent whispers. An older man with work-hardened hands ignored his wife's tugging on his sleeve. A boy of perhaps 12 stared at Samuel with wide, curious eyes. "Mrs. Henderson," Samuel said quietly, "maybe this isn't the right time. I don't want to cause trouble for you." Eleanor sat down beside him, her back straight as a rod. "Samuel, my husband spent his last weeks talking about the songs he remembered from his childhood, about how they taught him that God's love was bigger than man's hatred. He made me promise to have you sing at his service, and I intend to keep that promise." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "He wrote this for you, for when this day came." Samuel unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written by a man near death. "Samuel Washington, your grandfather's voice lives on in yours. Sing the songs that saved my soul. Sing them loud enough for heaven to hear. And maybe this old world will finally learn what my grandfather's generation was too afraid to understand." Henry Washington Henderson. Samuel felt tears threatening, but he held them back. The church was watching, waiting. Some with hatred, some with curiosity, but all with the weight of history pressing down on them. "What song would you have me sing?" he asked Eleanor. She smiled then, and for a moment he could see the young woman she had once been. The one my husband hummed on his deathbed. The one about going home. Samuel rose from the pew, his guitar case still slung across his back. The remaining congregation watched in stunned silence as he made his way to the front of the church, where the pulpit stood like a monument to tradition and prejudice. Pastor Williams stepped aside reluctantly, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, but Eleanor Henderson's steely gaze kept him from saying more. Samuel opened his guitar case with deliberate care, his fingers tracing the worn wood of the instrument that had been his companion for more years than he could count. It had belonged to his grandfather, the same Samuel Washington who had worked these lands and sung these songs. The church was so quiet that the sound of tuning pegs being adjusted seemed to echo from the rafters. Samuel could feel the weight of every eye upon him, the mixture of hatred and curiosity that filled the air like smoke. He adjusted the guitar strap across his shoulder and looked out at the congregation. The elderly woman who had protested was gone, along with several families. But others remained, some leaning forward in their seats, others sitting rigid with disapproval. "The song Mrs. Henderson's husband requested," Samuel said, his voice carrying clearly through the church, "is called 'I'm Going Home.' It's about the journey we all take, regardless of the color of our skin." He began to play, his fingers finding the familiar chords that had been passed down through generations. The melody was simple, haunting, filled with the pain and hope of a people who had learned to find God in the darkest places. When Samuel opened his mouth to sing, the sound that emerged was unlike anything that had ever filled these walls. It was deep and rich, carrying the weight of centuries of struggle and faith. It was the voice of cotton fields and chain gangs, of midnight prayers and Sunday morning worship, of a people who had learned to sing their pain into something beautiful. I'm going home to a place where I belong, where the color of my skin don't matter to the King above. I'm going home, sweet Lord. I'm going home." The words washed over the congregation like a wave, and Samuel could see the effect they were having. The young woman near the back had tears streaming down her face. The older man with work-hardened hands was leaning forward, his eyes wide with wonder, but it was Eleanor Henderson who surprised him most. The widow, who had sat so straight and proud, was now bent forward, her hands pressed to her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Samuel continued to sing, his voice growing stronger with each verse. He sang of struggle and redemption, of finding grace in unexpected places, of the God who loved all his children equally. "When I was lost, he found me. When I was blind, he made me see. That home ain't about the building, it's about the love that sets you free. I'm going home, sweet Lord. I'm going home." Pastor Williams stood frozen behind the pulpit, his face pale as parchment. Samuel could see the conflict in his eyes, the way his carefully constructed world was being shaken by the power of this song. A movement in the back of the church caught Samuel's attention. The young woman who had been crying stood up slowly, her voice joining his in harmony. She sang tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, her clear soprano blending with his deep baritone. I'm going home, to a place where I belong." The older man with work-hardened hands began to hum along, his voice rough but earnest. Then the boy of 12, his pure treble adding a third harmony line. One by one, voices began to join the song. Not all of them. Some sat in stony silence, their faces hard with disapproval. But enough to create something Samuel had never heard before, a mixed congregation singing together, their voices rising toward heaven in a harmony that transcended the color of their skin. Eleanor Henderson lifted her head, her eyes red with tears but shining with something that might have been joy. She added her voice to the chorus, her words clear and strong. "Where the color of my skin don't matter to the King above. I'm going home, sweet Lord, I'm going home." The song built to a crescendo, voices blending in a way that seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. Samuel felt the presence of something greater than himself, something that had been waiting for this moment for generations. When the last note faded away, the silence that followed was different from before. It was not the silence of shock or disapproval, but the silence of people who had experienced something sacred, something that had touched their souls in ways they couldn't fully understand. Samuel lowered his guitar, his hands still trembling from the power of what had just happened. He looked out at the congregation, at the faces that had been transformed by music, and he saw something he had never expected to see in this place. Hope. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Samuel stood at the front of the church, his guitar still in his hands, waiting for the storm he knew was coming. Pastor Williams was the first to break the quiet, his voice shaking with rage. "This is an abomination, a mockery of everything this church stands for." But before he could continue, Eleanor Henderson rose from her seat, her back straight and her eyes blazing with an inner fire that seemed to light up the entire church. "Pastor Williams," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to command respect, "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say." The pastor's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. "My husband built this church with his own hands," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He laid every brick, painted every wall, carved every pew. And he did it because he believed that this should be a place where all of God's children could come to worship." She walked to the front of the church, standing beside Samuel with a defiance that sent ripples of shock through the remaining congregation. "Henry Henderson was not the man you thought he was," she said, her eyes scanning the faces before her. "He was better than that. He was a man who understood that God's love knows no color, no class, no boundary, except the one we create in our own hearts." The young woman who had sung along stood up, her voice trembling but clear. "Mrs. Henderson, I felt something when we were singing. Something I've never felt before in this church." "What's your name, dear?" Eleanor asked kindly. "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell." "And what did you feel, Sarah?" The young woman glanced around nervously, aware that her husband and others were staring at her with disapproval. I felt like God was really here, like he was listening to every word." Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile Samuel had seen from her. "That's because he was, dear. God doesn't hear the color of our voices. He hears the truth in our hearts." The older man with work-hardened hands stood up slowly, his hat clutched in his weathered fingers. "Ma'am, I've been coming to this church for 30 years, and I ain't never heard singing like that before. Made me feel like maybe I've been missing something important." "What's your name?" Eleanor asked. Tom Bradley." "And what do you think you've been missing, Tom?" Tom looked around the church, his eyes settling on the empty pews where families had walked out in protest. I think maybe I've been so worried about keeping folks out that I forgot about letting God in." Pastor Williams stepped forward, his face red with fury. "This is enough. Eleanor, you may think you can buy your way into heaven with your husband's money, but you can't change the natural order of things. There are coloreds, and there are whites, and God intended them to worship separately." Samuel had remained silent through most of this exchange, but now he stepped forward, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of years of struggle and faith. "Pastor," he said, "I've been in a lot of churches. White churches, colored churches, churches that were nothing more than a clearing in the woods. And I've learned one thing. God doesn't live in the building. He lives in the hearts of the people who come seeking him." He gestured to the guitar in his hands. "This belonged to my grandfather, the same man who taught Henry Henderson that music was the voice of the soul. And my grandfather taught me something that I think you've forgotten." Pastor Williams sneered. "And what's that?" "That the most beautiful sound in the world is voices raised together in praise, regardless of the color of the skin they come from." The 12-year-old boy who had hummed along during the song suddenly stood up, his young voice clear and strong. "Mama, why does God care what color people are?" His mother, clearly uncomfortable, tried to pull him back down. "Hush, Johnny. Sit down." But Johnny remained standing, his innocent eyes fixed on Samuel. "Sir, can you teach me to play guitar like that?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Samuel looked at Eleanor, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "I reckon I could," Samuel said, "if your mama don't mind." Johnny's mother looked around the church, aware that all eyes were on her. Samuel could see the war playing out in her face, years of conditioning battling against the wonder she had seen in her son's eyes during the song. I don't know, she said finally. Think about it, Eleanor said gently. Think about what you felt when we were all singing together. Think about whether that felt like God's presence or like something evil. Pastor Williams made one last desperate attempt to regain control. This is madness. Eleanor, the church board will hear about this. They'll remove you from your position. Eleanor's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Pastor Williams, I am the church board. My family's money built this church, and my family's money keeps it running. And if you don't like the way I choose to honor my husband's memory, you're free to find another church to pastor. The threat hung in the air like a sword, and Pastor Williams seemed to deflate before their eyes. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the church, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Samuel watched him go, feeling no triumph, only sadness for a man who had let fear and hatred close his heart to the very love he claimed to serve. Eleanor turned to the remaining congregation, her voice soft but carrying clearly through the church. My husband is gone, but his dream lives on. This church will be a place where all of God's children are welcome, where the only requirement for worship is a heart that seeks the Lord. She paused, looking at each face in turn. Some of you may choose to leave, and I understand that. Change is hard, and this is a big change. But for those who stay, I promise you this. You will hear the voice of God in ways you never imagined. Sarah Mitchell stood up again, her voice stronger now. Mrs. Henderson, I'd like to stay. I'd like to learn more about what we experienced today. Tom Bradley nodded his agreement. Me too. I got a feeling there's more to learn. One by one, the remaining members of the congregation stood up, their faces showing a mixture of uncertainty and hope. Not all of them. Some remained seated, clearly struggling with what they had witnessed, but enough to show that something fundamental had changed in this small church in Millbrook, Texas. Samuel looked around at the faces before him, seeing the beginning of something that might, with time and patience, grow into the kind of church Henry Henderson had dreamed of. A place where voices could be raised together in praise, regardless of the color of the skin they came from. Eleanor Henderson walked over to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Samuel, would you consider staying? Not just for today, but would you consider making this your church home? Samuel looked around the church one more time, seeing the empty pews where the protesters had sat, the uncertain faces of those who remained, the hope in the eyes of the young woman and the old man and the boy who wanted to learn guitar. Mrs. Henderson, he said quietly, I think your husband would be proud of what happened here today. She smiled, and for a moment, the weight of years seemed to lift from her shoulders. I think he would too. As the congregation began to file out of the church, Samuel could hear them talking among themselves, their voices filled with wonder and confusion and the tentative hope of people who had glimpsed something larger than themselves. The young woman, Sarah, stopped beside him as she walked toward the door. Mr. Washington, will you be here next Sunday? Samuel looked at Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly. I reckon I will be. Good, Sarah said, smiling shyly. I'd like to hear you sing again. As the last of the congregation left, Samuel and Eleanor stood alone in the church, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows and casting long shadows across the empty pews. You know, Eleanor said quietly, this is just the beginning. There will be more resistance, more people who leave, more challenges ahead. Samuel nodded, understanding the weight of what they had started. I know, but sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single step. Eleanor smiled, and in that smile, Samuel saw the reflection of her husband's dream, a dream of a church where all of God's children could come home. Outside, the bells of Millbrook began to ring, calling the faithful to worship, their voices rising toward heaven in a harmony that transcended the boundaries of race and class and fear. And in the little white church at the end of the dusty street, two unlikely allies stood together, knowing that they had witnessed something sacred, something that would echo through the generations like a song that refuses to be silenced. The voice that had made the widow weep had also made her hope, and in that hope, the seeds of change had been planted in ground that had been barren for far too long. In the days that followed, whispers spread like wildfire through the small town of Millbrook. What had unfolded inside the church that Sunday became the talk of every general store, barber shop, and kitchen table. Some called it a disgrace, others a miracle. But regardless of which side they stood on, no one could ignore what had happened. On Tuesday morning, Samuel returned to the church. The doors were unlocked, sunlight spilling through the stained glass windows, illuminating the dust that danced lazily in the air. He set his guitar case on the front pew and sat alone in the silence, letting the echoes of Sunday's song settle back into his bones. This place, once cold and segregated, now held a warmth he hadn't felt in years, a warmth born not of temperature, but of truth. A knock on the door broke his reflection. It was Johnny, the boy from before, holding a battered notebook and wearing a hopeful grin. "Mama said I could come for 1 hour if I finished my chores." Samuel laughed, motioning him in. "1 hour it is." As the boy sat and strummed awkwardly, his small fingers fighting with the strings, Samuel saw in him what Henry must have seen in so many others, a spark, something unformed but sacred. Music, like faith, was a language of becoming. By Thursday, Sarah Mitchell had returned too, not to sing this time, but to sit. She brought a basket of food, setting it gently on the table in the back hall. "In case anyone's hungry," she said softly. She stayed for an hour, listening as Samuel practiced old hymns on his guitar, her hands trembling only slightly when she finally joined in on the second verse. More people trickled in as the week wore on. Tom Bradley stopped by after work, still in his dusty overalls, asking if help was needed repairing a broken hinge on the back door. Mrs. Ellsworth, the widow who had always sat near the stained glass window with a shawl over her shoulders, dropped off candles she'd poured herself. Even Mr. Carver, the blacksmith known for never stepping foot inside any church, lingered just outside the threshold, hat in hand, listening. But not everyone was drawn in by the change. A group of elders from another congregation met in quiet opposition. They spoke of tradition, of divine order, of knowing one's place. They sent letters. They made phone calls. They urged neighbors to stay away, warning that a church that welcomed disorder would bring divine judgment upon the town. Eleanor received every letter, read every word, and filed them neatly in a drawer labeled, "History Trying to Repeat Itself." "Let them talk," she told Samuel. "Let them shout if they must. Their noise only proves how quiet they've been when it mattered most." By Sunday morning, the second week, no one knew what to expect. The town was divided. Some feared confrontation, others prayed for peace. But as the sun rose over Millbrook, casting golden light across the steeple, people began to arrive. This time there was no explosive confrontation. No one stormed out. The sanctuary filled slowly, awkwardly, as those who had stayed the week before took their places again. A few of the protesters returned, hesitant but curious. They sat in the back, arms crossed, eyes watchful. Samuel took his place at the front, guitar in hand. Eleanor stepped beside him, her expression calm but fierce. "Before we begin," she said, her voice carrying over the pews, "I want to remind you of something Henry told me once. He said that faith without love is just noise. And this house is no place for noise without meaning." There were no hymnal books passed out that morning. Instead, Samuel began to play a slow, solemn melody, one not found in any hymnal but known by heart. One by one, voices joined him. First Sarah, then Tom, then little Johnny, strumming along on his borrowed guitar. Even some of those who had doubted the week before found themselves humming. The music rose, not in perfect harmony, but in real, flawed, beautiful human sound. In that moment, the church wasn't a building. It was a vessel. And every soul inside, broken or brave, angry or hopeful, became part of something far bigger than tradition. They became part of a truth that could no longer be silenced. And outside, the town of Millbrook listened. unable to ignore the sound of a new kind of worship rising into the sky.